Sergeant Almeida, his uniform puffed with arrogance, pointed a finger at the woman before him. "Do you know who you're talking to, socialite? I am the law here, and you, a mere ex-lieutenant, won't tell me what to do." The woman, with a serene expression, simply watched him, an almost imperceptible glint in her eyes. The sergeant, blind with his own arrogance, turned to one of his subordinates, a sneer on his face. "Handcuff her and take this mad woman to the station for contempt." Little did he know that every word, every gesture was being meticulously recorded, and that the ex-lieutenant before him was, in fact, the Chief of Internal Affairs for the Civil Police, conducting an anonymous inspection. Sergeant Almeida's sneer quickly vanished, transforming into icy dread, when the woman, with a calm and firm voice, revealed her true rank, sealing the arrogant officer's fate. He, who had ordered handcuffs, would be the next to feel them on his wrists, in a public humiliation that would culminate in his expulsion from the force. The thin air of that forgotten street seemed to freeze, turning into shards of ice that shattered in Sergeant Almeida's chest. The sneer that had twisted his face moments ago collapsed, giving way to a mask of icy terror. His eyes, once sparkling with arrogance, widened, fixed on the woman before him. Her words, "Chief of Internal Affairs for the Civil Police," echoed not only in the environment, but within his own mind, like the mournful toll of a bell announcing the end. Cold sweat trickled down Almeida's neck, dampening the collar of the uniform he so often used as a shield. His body, once rigid with authority, now trembled uncontrollably. The voice that moments earlier had barked orders and humiliations was now a dry gasp in his throat. He tried to speak, perhaps to stammer an apology, but the words refused to come out, trapped in a knot of terror and disbelief. How was it possible? That woman, whom he had just called a socialite and a mad woman, whom he had ordered handcuffed, was the highest authority of internal affairs. The irony, cruel and relentless, bit into his soul. The other officers, who until then had watched the scene with the complacency of those witnessing a routine abuse of power, were struck by a similar wave of shock. Their faces, previously impassive, now displayed a mix of confusion, fear, and belated recognition. Some of them, older, had already heard of the Chief of Internal Affairs' reputation, a relentless woman, known for her anonymous inspections and for not tolerating misconduct. They knew that when she acted, the consequences were definitive. A murmur of muffled voices began to rise, but was quickly silenced by the chief's unwavering posture. She, for her part, did not alter her serene expression by a millimeter. There was no triumph in her gaze, only the cold determination of one fulfilling a duty. Her eyes, which had previously held an almost imperceptible glint, now radiated unquestionable authority. She did not need to shout, did not need to gesticulate. Her mere presence and the revelation of her rank were enough to dismantle Sergeant Almeida's pretense of power. With a voice still calm, but now laden with a weight that silenced any lingering doubt, the Chief of Internal Affairs addressed the nearest officer, a young recruit who looked about to faint. "Officer," she said, and the word sounded like an unquestionable command. "You heard Sergeant Almeida's orders. He asked that I be handcuffed for contempt, but as you can see, the situation has changed." She paused, allowing the gravity of her words to sink in. "Now I, Chief of Internal Affairs for the Civil Police, give you a new order. Sergeant Almeida is under arrest for abuse of authority, contempt of a superior officer in service, and for conduct incompatible with public office. Handcuff him." The young officer hesitated for a split second, his gaze divided between the sergeant, who now looked like a melting wax statue, and the chief, who watched him with silent expectation. The weight of the decision was overwhelming, but hierarchy in the end prevailed. With trembling hands, he drew the handcuffs from his belt. Almeida, in a last pathetic act of desperation, tried to retreat, his eyes pleading with his own men, but there was no salvation. The fear of the Chief of Internal Affairs was greater than any forced loyalty to the sergeant. The metallic click of the handcuffs closing on Almeida's wrists echoed like a gunshot in the quiet street. The humiliation was palpable, a heavy cloak that enveloped him. He, the man who considered himself the law, who bellowed orders and threats, was now handcuffed powerless before his own subordinates and the woman he had tried to intimidate. His eyes filled with tears of fury and shame, but he dared not look up at the chief. "All your actions, Sergeant Almeida," her voice continued relentless, "from the moment you approached this patrol car to the order to handcuff me, have been recorded. Every word, every gesture of your arrogance, this material will be attached to the administrative process that will result in your expulsion from the force. There is no place for individuals like you in our police." The mention of the recording was the final blow. Almeida felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. It was not just the public humiliation, not just the loss of his position. It was the destruction of everything he thought he was. The Chief of Internal Affairs then turned to another officer, an older sergeant, who watched the scene with an expression of resignation. "Sergeant," she continued, "take this man to the police station. He will be charged and held at the disposal of Internal Affairs, and ensure that all procedures are followed to the letter. Any deviation, and you will be the next to answer." The older sergeant nodded, his voice hoarse. "Yes, Chief." He approached Almeida, who was now just a hunched figure, and led him to one of the patrol cars. As he was pushed into the back seat, Almeida cast a last look of hatred and despair at the chief. But she had already turned her back, her focus now on her subordinates, who awaited her next instructions with renewed discipline and a silent terror. The lesson had been taught, and the price, paid in public, would serve as a warning to all who dared to forget the true essence of the law. The system, at times, corrected itself in unexpected and brutal ways. The silence that followed the departure of the patrol car with Sergeant Almeida handcuffed was more deafening than any scream. A silence laden with shame, fear, and brutal understanding. The Chief of Internal Affairs, with the same unperturbed calm, turned to the remaining officers. Her eyes scanned each face, unhurriedly, as if cataloguing every expression of shock and apprehension. There was no anger in her gaze, only a cold and unquestionable authority that penetrated their uniforms and reached the souls of each one. The young officer who had handcuffed Almeida still trembled slightly. His hands, which had carried out the order with almost mechanical obedience, now felt heavy, stained by an act he never imagined performing against a superior. He represented the new generation, the crossroads between blind obedience and the ethics that the Chief of Internal Affairs personified. The others, more experienced, tried to disguise their dread, but the stiffness of their shoulders and the fixity of their gazes betrayed the internal torment. They had witnessed the fall of a colleague, a brother in uniform, and knew that the line separating complacency from complicity had just been redrawn in cold blood. The Chief of Internal Affairs did not need to raise her voice. Her presence filled the space, dictating the rhythm of everyone's breathing. "The mission of the police," she began, and her voice was a steel thread, "is to serve and protect. It is not to oppress, not to intimidate, and certainly not to use the power granted by the state for personal gain or to humiliate citizens." Sergeant Almeida forgot that, and the price of such forgetfulness is high. She paused, allowing her words to settle like heavy stones. "Each of you," she continued, "swore to uphold the law. That oath is not a formality, it is a lifelong commitment, a pact with the society you serve. What happened here today was not an isolated incident. It was the manifestation of a culture that allowed arrogance and abuse of power to take root. That culture, my dear officers, has come to an end. The officers exchanged glances, a silent dread spreading among them. The chief was not just punishing Almeida, she was dismantling a system of veiled complicity, of turning a blind eye that many of them had practiced or witnessed. The recording, mentioned earlier, hung in the air like a sword of Damocles. It was not just proof against Almeida, but proof that vigilance was constant, that the invisibility of the chief's anonymity could be around any corner, at any moment. From today, the Chief of Internal Affairs declared, and the phrase marked a turning point, every action of yours will be seen in a new light. There will be no more room for arrogance, for disrespect, for corruption, whether small or large. The force is undergoing a cleansing, and those who do not align with the principles of integrity and ethics will be removed, without exception. She directed her gaze directly at the young officer. "Officer," she said, and the young man straightened up, his heart pounding in his chest. "You carried out a difficult order, and you carried it out correctly. Always remember that true loyalty is to the law, to justice, and to the population that trusts you, not to individuals who dishonor the uniform." Then her attention turned to the older sergeant who had taken Almeida away. "Sergeant," she continued, "you have years of service, years of experience. Use that experience to guide your men, to reinforce the values that were so brutally reminded today. The responsibility of leadership is also the responsibility to oversee and correct. Do not let fear or convenience prevent you from doing what is right." The older sergeant nodded, his voice choked. "Yes, Chief, understood." The Chief of Internal Affairs took a step forward, her posture imposing. "From now on, all patrol cars in this unit will be equipped with body cameras and internal cameras, with continuous recording and cloud storage, accessible to Internal Affairs. Every stop, every interaction with the public will be recorded, not as a tool of distrust, but as a guarantee of transparency and protection, both for the citizen and for the honest officer." The news of the cameras added a new layer of tension. The era of impunity, of the shadow where many hid, was officially over. The air of the street, previously thinned by dread, now seemed electrified by the promise of a new order, but also by the constant threat of surveillance. "This is not the end," the chief concluded, her voice resonating with the gravity of a verdict. "It is just the beginning of a necessary transformation. Get back to work. And remember what you saw and heard here today. Let it serve as a lesson, let it serve as a guide, and let it serve as a warning." With those words, she turned her back on the officers who remained motionless, absorbing the magnitude of that morning. The sun, which had previously seemed indifferent, now cast long, distorted shadows over the street, as if time itself was bending under the weight of that moment. The Chief of Internal Affairs, without looking back, walked towards her own unmarked vehicle, leaving behind a group of men in uniform, but with their certainties shattered, confronted with the harsh reality that the law, at times, turned against those who swore to defend it, when they themselves became its greatest transgressors. The system had begun to purge itself, and the smell of change hung heavy in the air. The soft hum of the Chief of Internal Affairs' unmarked vehicle broke the heavy silence that had settled on the street. As she settled behind the wheel, the image of the officers, still petrified in their positions, imprinted itself on her mind. There was no personal satisfaction in her eyes, only the cold realization of a task accomplished and the bitter certainty that it was only the first step of an arduous journey. The Chief of Internal Affairs, whose name and face were now synonymous with unbreakable authority, was not driven by revenge, but by an implacable sense of duty, As the car drove away, the rearview mirror reflected the diminishing scene. The uniformed men, now mere silhouettes under the morning sun, seemed to have aged a decade in a few minutes. The lesson had been brutal, public, and unforgettable, but the chief knew that memory, however vivid, was fertile ground for complacency, and that true change would require more than a single act of retribution. Her thoughts flew to Sergeant Almeida, now on his way to the police station, handcuffed and stripped of his dignity. He was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was systemic, a web of connivance, fear, and misunderstood power that corroded the foundation of the force. The recording, the irrefutable proof of his arrogance, would be the first of many. The body cameras and in-car cameras were not just a technological advancement. They were a declaration of war on impunity, a shield for the just and a sword for the corrupt. The Chief of Internal Affairs was not deceived. She knew that resistance would be fierce. Many benefited from the status quo, from the shadow where responsibility dissolved and abuse flourished. But she was ready. Her career had been built on the rock of integrity, and her reputation, forged in silent battles in the corridors of justice, was her armor. As the car turned a corner, the ex-lieutenant, who until then had remained in the background, watched the chief's departure. His face, previously marked by the resignation of someone expecting the worst, now carried a complex mixture of relief, surprise, and a hint of melancholy. He, the man who had been expelled under circumstances not yet revealed, the target of Almeida's arrogance, had witnessed the fall of his tormentor in a way he could never have imagined. For him, the scene was a mirror. Almeida, handcuffed and humiliated, was the image of what he himself had feared becoming, or what the force had turned him into. Justice, for the ex-lieutenant, was a capricious entity, which sometimes abandoned him, sometimes vindicated him in unexpected ways. What the Chief of Internal Affairs had done was more than punish a corrupt officer. It was to restore, for a brief moment, faith in a system he believed had failed irremediably. But Almeida's downfall was not his own victory. The chief had acted in the name of the law, of the force, not specifically in his personal defense. He still carried the weight of his past, the stigma of being an ex-lieutenant, a man who, for some reason, had fallen from grace. That episode, however dramatic, did not erase his history, nor did it solve the problems that had led him to that street at that moment. Under Almeida's inquisitive gaze, he wondered if the Chief of Internal Affairs had recognized him, if she knew who he was, what he represented, or if he was just another citizen, a pretext for the manifestation of her implacable justice. The uncertainty hung in the air, as dense as the silence the remaining officers maintained. Back in her vehicle, the Chief of Internal Affairs was already making a call. Prepare the meeting room. I want all department heads and internal affairs directors present in 1 hour, and request the full report on Sergeant Almeida, including his disciplinary history and all previous complaints. I also want an analysis of the situation of that unit, focusing on complaint indices and officer conduct reports. The cleansing has begun. Her voice was firm, devoid of emotion. The adrenaline of the confrontation had been replaced by cold, strategic determination. She knew Almeida was just the tip of the iceberg. The real battle would be fought in offices, in reports, in restructurings. It would be a war of nerves, bureaucracy, and veiled resistance. But she was ready for each of those challenges. The city sped by the car window, a blur of colors and sounds. Somewhere, other Almeidas continued to operate in the shadows, confident in their impunity. But the Chief of Internal Affairs had lit a light, and from that day on, the shadow would be an increasingly dangerous place to hide. The system, wounded and worn, began to move, driven by a woman who was not afraid to face its own demons. And the ex-lieutenant, watching from afar, felt that his own story, in some way, was about to intersect again with the relentless machinery of justice. The rumble of the Chief of Internal Affairs' car engine faded into the distance, carrying with it not only the imposing figure of the woman, but also the echo of an authority that refused to be silenced. For the ex-lieutenant, watching the scene disappear, the silence that followed was denser than any noise. It was a silence laden with questions, unexpected relief, and a melancholy that clung to his soul like a persistent shadow. He was no longer the center of attention, but the stage of that drama still seemed to revolve around him. Almeida, the sergeant who had humiliated him, was on his way to a fate he himself knew well: public disgrace, the stripping of his uniform, the indelible stain on his reputation. It was a revenge he never sought, but which in some way had found him. Poetic justice, perhaps, but it did not erase his own scars. The ex-lieutenant, whose name had not yet been spoken, felt the weight of his own history. That moment, however cathartic, did not redeem him. He was still the man who had lost everything, the exemplary professional who, for a reason still nebulous, had been expelled from the force he loved. The chief had acted in the name of the law, of the institution, not in his personal defense. He was merely a catalyst, a pretext for a cleansing that was already underway. His eyes scanned the remaining officers, who now dispersed slowly, as if awakening from a trance. They looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect, but also with a certain apprehension. He was living proof that the system could devour its own children, and now, proof that the system could at times correct itself, albeit brutally. The ex-lieutenant's mind flew to the past. He remembered the day he himself had been confronted, not by an arrogant sergeant, but by a web of intrigues and accusations that had entangled him. He had been a promising lieutenant, with an impeccable record, dedicated to justice and ethics, but the force, like a living organism, had its own diseases, its cancerous cells that spread silently. He had become a target, a fish too big to be ignored, or perhaps an idealist too inconvenient to be tolerated. The recording, the irrefutable proof that had sealed Almeida's fate, was a bitter reminder. In his own case, the evidence had been fabricated, distorted, or simply ignored. No one had appeared to defend him with the same vehemence as the Chief of Internal Affairs. No camera had recorded the truth of his innocence. Justice, for him, had been blind but not impartial. It had been manipulated, and he, the victim. A heavy sigh escaped his lips. The morning sun, which had previously seemed indifferent, now warmed him, but could not dispel the cold in his chest. He still carried the stigma, the weight of being an ex. That episode, though it had partly vindicated him, did not restore his uniform, nor the honor that had been stolen from him. He wondered if the Chief of Internal Affairs, in her penetrating gaze, had seen beyond the ordinary citizen. If she had recognized the glimmer of a past he tried to forget, but which still defined him, or if he was just another face in the crowd, a number in her statistics of injustice. The uncertainty was a heavy burden, almost as heavy as the resignation that had accompanied him for years. The chief had declared a war on impunity, a cleansing. But where did he fit into that? Was he one of the removed that the chief had mentioned, an example of what should not be, or a potential ally? Someone who could offer an internal perspective on the corruption she was determined to eradicate. The idea of being called, of having his story re-examined, ignited a small flame of hope, quickly suffocated by skepticism. Bureaucracy, he knew, was a thousand-headed monster, and justice, an endless labyrinth. He began to walk without a clear destination, leaving behind the scene that had changed Almeida's life and perhaps the course of the force. Each step was an echo of his own journey, of his fall and his silent struggle to rebuild a life outside the shadows of the uniform. The street, once the stage of an intense drama, now seemed ordinary, but for him it was imbued with new meaning. The Chief of Internal Affairs, in her car, was already immersed in reports and strategies, charting the next steps of her relentless crusade. She did not know, or perhaps did not yet know, that the man she had indirectly saved was a crucial piece in the puzzle she was assembling. A piece that, if fitted correctly, could reveal the depths of the rot she intended to clean. The ex-lieutenant, oblivious to the chief's plans, felt that the machinery of justice, which had once crushed him, now seemed to turn again, and he, in some way, was about to be dragged back to its center. That day was not the end of his ordeal, but the prelude to a new chapter where past and present would collide, and the truth, finally, could come to light. He only hoped that this time justice would not be so blind. The ex-lieutenant continued to walk, each step echoing the heavy silence that the Chief of Internal Affairs' departure had left behind. The street, once a stage of drama and humiliation, now seemed ordinary, but for him it was imbued with new meaning. The morning sun, which had previously seemed indifferent, now warmed him, but could not dispel the cold in his chest. He still carried the stigma, the weight of being an ex. That episode, though it had partly vindicated him, did not restore his uniform, nor the honor that had been stolen from him. He turned a corner, leaving behind the last vestiges of that confrontation. His eyes fixed on a modest cafe a few blocks away, a refuge he had found in recent years. Routine was his anchor, a shield against the chaos of a past that insisted on haunting him. But today, routine seemed fragile, threatened by the eruption of justice into his life, albeit indirectly. Meanwhile, the Chief of Internal Affairs was already in the meeting room, the air heavy with expectation and a certain veiled nervousness. The department heads and internal affairs directors were seated at the table, some with expressions of respect, others with a caution bordering on apprehension. She wasted no time with formalities. "Good morning, everyone." Her voice cut the silence like a sharp blade. "As you know, the cleansing has begun. The incident with Sergeant Almeida was just the first step, and I assure you it will not be the last." She paused, sweeping the room with her eyes, making sure everyone understood the gravity of the situation. "I want full reports on all misconduct complaints from the last 5 years, not just those that resulted in disciplinary proceedings, but all complaints that were filed, ignored, or considered low priority. I want to know why they were filed away. I want to know who filed them away." A discreet murmur ran through the room, quickly silenced by the chief's penetrating gaze. "Furthermore, I want a detailed analysis of complaint indices by unit. I'm not just interested in the number, but the nature of these complaints. Are there patterns? Are there units that consistently present more problems? And more importantly, are there officers who repeatedly appear in different complaints, even if in secondary roles?" She leaned slightly over the table, her posture conveying unwavering determination. The technology of body cameras and patrol car cameras is a powerful tool, but it is only that, a tool. True change will come from our willingness to use it to expose the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. Many of you have benefited from a system that allowed certain things to be swept under the rug. That time is over. A director, an older man with years of service, cleared his throat. "Chief, with all due respect, this is a Herculean task. Reviewing all these cases, it will require a huge team and a lot of time." "I know," she replied without a hint of hesitation, "and I am willing to provide the necessary resources. If we need more staff, we will have them. If we need more time, we will have it. But inaction is not an option. The reputation of this force is at stake, and frankly, the safety of our citizens as well." She stood up, walking to the window and observing the city below. "Make no mistake, resistance will be fierce. Those who benefit from the shadows will not give up easily. They will try to discredit us, intimidate us, sabotage us. But I am ready for it. And I hope you are too. Turning back to the table, her eyes fell on one of the younger directors, a man known for his integrity and for being one of the first to support the camera initiative. Director Santos, I want you to lead the review team. Start with Sergeant Almeida's unit. I want a complete audit of all officers in that unit, their history, their promotions, their conduct reports. And I want you to investigate any old case, any filed complaint that may have been neglected or worse, suppressed. The mention of old cases and suppressed complaints resonated in the room. It was a clear sign that the chief was not just interested in recent incidents, but in unearthing the rot that had accumulated for years. She was opening the doors of the past, and that meant many skeletons could come out of the closet. As the meeting proceeded, with the chief outlining her relentless strategy, the ex-lieutenant, a few blocks away, sat in his cafe, the smell of fresh coffee and warm bread trying unsuccessfully to calm the storm in his soul. He did not know, but the machinery of justice, which had once crushed him, now seemed to turn again, and he, in some way, was about to be dragged back to its center. That day was not the end of his ordeal, but the prelude to a new chapter, where past and present would collide, and the truth, finally, could come to light. He only hoped that this time justice would not be so blind, and that perhaps the Chief of Internal Affairs was looking for more than just a name on a report. Perhaps she was looking for a story, his story. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the sweetness of warm bread were a balm for the soul, but not for the ex-lieutenant's mind. He watched the steam rise from his cup, a translucent veil that seemed to emulate the mist that still hung over his own past. The street outside, now calm, was a vivid reminder of the storm that had just passed, and of the one that he felt was yet to come. The Chief of Internal Affairs, in her abrupt departure, had left not only a trail of dust, but a tacit promise of change, a promise that for him was both a hope and a torment. He remembered her gaze, penetrating, almost inquisitive. There was something there that made him question if she had truly seen him, not as the ex that society had labeled him, but as the man he had been, the officer who had dedicated years of his life to the force before being discarded. The idea of being just another number in her statistics of injustice was a heavy burden, almost as heavy as the resignation that had accompanied him for years. But her mention of a cleansing, of a war on impunity, ignited a spark. Could it be possible that this time justice would not only be blind, but also capable of seeing through the shadows? His own downfall had been a silent spectacle, without cameras, without witnesses willing to speak. The accusation, a web of lies so well woven that it became irrefutable in the eyes of bureaucracy. He had been accused of negligence in a case of internal corruption, a perfect scapegoat to cover up the true culprits, powerful men who operated in the bowels of the force. The evidence against him, fabricated with surgical precision, had sealed his fate. No one had appeared to defend him with the same vehemence that the Chief of Internal Affairs had shown for Almeida. No camera had recorded the truth of his innocence. Justice for him had been blind, but not impartial. It had been manipulated, and he, the victim. A heavy sigh escaped his lips. The morning sun, which had previously seemed indifferent, now warmed him, but could not dispel the cold in his chest. He still carried the stigma, the weight of being an ex. That episode, though it had partly vindicated him, did not restore his uniform, nor the honor that had been stolen from him. He wondered if the Chief of Internal Affairs, in her penetrating gaze, had seen beyond the ordinary citizen. If she had recognized the glimmer of a past he tried to forget, but which still defined him, or if he was just another face in the crowd, a number in her statistics of injustice. The uncertainty was a heavy burden, almost as heavy as the resignation that had accompanied him for years. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, the Internal Affairs meeting room buzzed with a different energy, a mixture of apprehension and a strange sense of purpose. The Chief of Internal Affairs, after outlining her relentless strategy, observed Director Santos, a man who, she knew, shared her vision of a clean force. "Director Santos," her firm voice echoed, "I want you to start with a complete sweep. Not just Almeida's unit, but all units that have had a history of complaints resolved suspiciously. And most importantly, I want you to unearth any old case, any complaint that has been conveniently filed away or suppressed in the last 10 years. I don't care how deep the hole is or who is down there." Santos nodded, the seriousness of the task weighing on his face. He knew the chief was not joking. "Understood, Chief. I'm already mobilizing a team. We're going to digitize all physical files, cross-reference complaint data with conduct reports and promotions. It will be like looking for a needle in a haystack, but we will do it." The Chief of Internal Affairs allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. "It's not a needle, Director. It's a goldmine of rot. And I want you to find it. Start with the negligence cases that resulted in summary dismissals or expulsions, those where the official narrative seemed too good to be true." The mention of negligence and summary dismissals resonated in the room and somehow seemed to vibrate in the air, reaching the cafe where the ex-lieutenant was still sitting. He could not hear the words, but he felt the change in the atmosphere, an invisible current that seemed to pull him. The chief was opening the doors of the past, and that meant many skeletons could come out of the closet. And one of those skeletons, he knew, was his. Director Santos, with his newly formed team, plunged headfirst into the monumental task. The first boxes of dusty files began to arrive, stacks of paper representing years of untold stories, of silenced injustices. He began to see patterns, small inconsistencies, names that appeared and disappeared like ghosts in the system. One case in particular caught his attention, a dismissal process of a lieutenant 7 years ago, under the accusation of negligence in a case of internal corruption. The documentation was impeccable, almost too impeccable. Something was missing, a link, a voice. The speed with which the process had been concluded, the absence of significant appeals, everything smelled of a cover-up. In the cafe, the ex-lieutenant paid his bill, the coffee cup empty, but his mind full. He stood up, the routine of his simple life now seeming like a fragile disguise. That day was not the end of his ordeal, but the prelude to a new chapter where past and present would collide, and the truth finally could come to light. He only hoped that this time justice would not be so blind, and that, perhaps, the Chief of Internal Affairs was looking for more than just a name on a report. Perhaps she was looking for a story, his story. He left the cafe, the morning sun now higher in the sky, illuminating the street. The world seemed the same, but he knew it was not. The machinery of justice, which had once crushed him, now seemed to turn again, and he, in some way, was about to be dragged back to its center. The Chief of Internal Affairs in her office reviewed the first preliminary reports, the determination in her eyes unwavering. She did not yet know the ex-lieutenant's name, but she knew she was close to unearthing the truth he represented. The hunt for the ghosts of the past had begun, and the first of them was about to be found. The game was just beginning, and the stakes were high. The dust of old archives seemed to have a weight of its own, a smell of forgotten stories and suppressed truths. In the Internal Affairs office, Director Santos, with his shirt sleeves rolled up, plunged headfirst into this sea of paper. His team, a mix of idealistic newcomers and tired but still upright veterans, worked tirelessly, digitizing, cross-referencing data, looking for anomalies. The Chief of Internal Affairs had been clear, "I don't care how deep the hole is or who is down there." And Santos took that order seriously. Among piles of dusty documents and digitized reports, a name began to emerge with an uncomfortable frequency: Lieutenant Ricardo Mendez. The case of his dismissal 7 years ago for serious negligence in a case of internal corruption was what most caught Santos's attention. The documentation was, as he had noted, impeccable, too perfect. Every form filled with surgical precision, every testimony aligned, every bureaucratic step completed in record time. It was the absence of any flaw, of any questioning, that screamed louder than any explicit irregularity. Santos spent the night poring over the details. He noticed that Mendez's process had been accelerated in an unusual way, almost as if there was an urgency to get rid of him. There were no significant appeals presented, no robust defense. It was as if Mendez had accepted his fate without a fight, which, for an officer with his history of commendations and a combatant profile, seemed totally out of character. And there was a detail, almost imperceptible, a small footnote in a conduct report that referenced a parallel investigation that was never attached to the main process. An investigation that apparently had been filed away due to lack of evidence. That lack of evidence was the needle Santos was looking for. He knew that, in cases of internal corruption, evidence did not disappear. It was made to disappear. He began to cross-reference the names of the officers involved in Mendez's accusation with other cases of negligence and suppressed complaints that his team was unearthing. And that's when the pattern began to form, a subtle but undeniable web. Several of the officers who testified against Mendez had been rapidly promoted in the following years. Some of them, in fact, had indirect links to Sergeant Almeida's unit, which the chief had instructed to investigate first. The chief of internal affairs in her office received the first preliminary reports. The list of cases resolved suspiciously was long, but Lieutenant Mendez's case, highlighted by Santos, stood out. The determination in her eyes was unwavering, but a hint of frustration began to emerge. "Director Santos," she said on the phone, her voice cutting through the air, "I want you to focus on this Lieutenant Mendez. I want everything about him. What was he investigating? Who were his direct superiors? And most importantly, who benefited from his downfall?" Santos felt the weight of the responsibility, but also a growing excitement. He was on the right track. "Chief, we are already pulling communication records from that time, trying to trace any contact Mendez had with internal affairs or the press before his dismissal. It's like digging up a fossil, but I feel we're close." Meanwhile, a few blocks away, the ex-lieutenant, Ricardo Mendez, felt a strange unease. The routine he had built for himself over the past 7 years, breakfast at the same place, occasional work as a security consultant, long walks to clear his head, began to feel fragile. He noticed longer stares, cars passing more than once. It was an old paranoia, a remnant from the time he knew he was being hunted, but now it seemed more real. That morning, upon opening the newspaper, a small footnote caught his attention. It spoke of the new chief of internal affairs and her crusade against internal corruption. There were no details, just a mention of a review of old cases and a promise to clean house. A shiver ran down his spine. Could it be possible? After so long, the machinery of justice was really turning again, and not to crush him, but perhaps to redeem him. He remembered that fateful day, the cold interrogation room, the fabricated accusations, the feeling of powerlessness. He had tried to fight, but the doors closed one by one. No one believed his version. No one wanted to hear that he was close to exposing an extortion network involving powerful figures within the force. He had been the perfect scapegoat, silenced and discarded. The idea that his story could finally be heard was both a hope and a torment. The hope of clearing his name, the torment of reliving the pain and betrayal. Ricardo stood up from the sofa, the newspaper falling to the floor. The morning sun, which had previously seemed indifferent, now warmed him, but could not dispel the cold in his chest. He still carried the stigma, the weight of being an ex. That episode, though it had partly vindicated him, did not restore his uniform, nor the honor that had been stolen from him. He wondered if the Chief of Internal Affairs, in her penetrating gaze, had seen beyond the ordinary citizen. If she had recognized the glimmer of a past he tried to forget, but which still defined him. Or if he was just another face in the crowd, a number in her statistics of injustice. The uncertainty was a heavy burden, almost as heavy as the resignation that had accompanied him for years. Meanwhile, the Chief of Internal Affairs, after hanging up the phone with Santos, walked to the window of her office. The city below seemed to vibrate with a contained energy. She knew she was stirring up a hornet's nest. An anonymous phone call had reached her desk, a distorted voice warning her not to dig too deep. A subtle threat, a reminder that the beneficiaries of the shadow were watching. But this only served to strengthen her conviction. The hunt for the ghosts of the past had intensified, and she felt that the first of them was about to be unearthed. The game was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than ever. The name Ricardo Mendez, now in her mind, was the key to opening the first door. The distorted voice on the Chief of Internal Affairs phone had been a chilling whisper, a veiled warning that instead of intimidating, ignited an even stronger flame in her eyes. "Don't dig too deep," the voice had said, and the chief, with the line already dead, felt the weight of the threat but also the confirmation that she was on the right track. The hornet's nest she had promised to disturb was in fact active. She called Director Santos. Her voice, normally calm, now carried a palpable urgency. "Director, unearth Lieutenant Mendez's parallel investigation. I don't care if it was filed away, if it was destroyed, if it was erased. I want every fragment. Who was in it? What did they discover? And above all, I want to know who signed off on its shelving. And don't forget Sergeant Almeida. He's a piece of this puzzle, I feel it." Santos, on the other end of the line, felt adrenaline course through his veins. The chief was not just investigating, she was hunting. He had already instructed his team to focus on Mendez's parallel investigation. It was the missing link, the piece that didn't fit the official narrative. The piles of dusty documents now seemed to whisper secrets, and he was determined to hear them. His team, exhausted but motivated by the chief's determination, worked in shifts. They had found a cryptic mention in a material disposal report, a reference to sensitive files that were supposed to be incinerated but which, due to a bureaucratic error, were only transferred to external storage. A loose thread, almost invisible, but which Santos grasped tightly. The external storage was a labyrinth of old documents, a forgotten warehouse in the city's outskirts, rarely visited. It would take days to get authorization and search the place, but Santos knew that was where the truth was hidden. He felt he was close to unraveling not only Mendez's case, but the modus operandi of a corruption network that extended far beyond a single lieutenant. The promotion of officers like Sergeant Almeida, the speed with which cases were suppressed, it all began to make sense. It was a system, not just isolated incidents. Meanwhile, Ricardo Mendez, the ex-lieutenant, felt every fiber of his being on high alert. The footnote in the newspaper had been just the trigger. The stares, previously just paranoia, were now more frequent, more direct. He noticed the same car parked on the corner for too long, the same person sitting in the opposite cafe, pretending to read a book. They weren't uniformed police, but men in suits, with a posture he knew well. That of someone who observes and reports. The routine that had protected him for 7 years was disintegrating. He could no longer afford to be just a discreet security consultant. His mind, trained for risk analysis and combat, began to draw scenarios, to assess threats. He remembered the last time he felt this sensation when he was about to expose the extortion network. The same feeling of being cornered, but this time with a crucial difference. He was not alone. The Chief of Internal Affairs somehow was opening a door for him. Ricardo decided to act, but with caution. He couldn't just go to Internal Affairs. That would make him an even bigger target. He needed information, confirmation. He began to mentally revisit the names, the faces, the details of that time. Who had he tried to contact? Who had betrayed him? And who perhaps could still be an ally? He remembered an old informant, a woman who worked in the forces administration, who had given him some crucial tips before his process. She had disappeared shortly after, fearing reprisals. Ricardo knew that finding her would be dangerous, but she might have the missing piece, the evidence he never managed to present. That night, Ricardo didn't sleep. He cleaned his weapon, an old 9mm he had kept since his days in service, and checked his communication equipment. It wasn't to attack, but to defend himself. He had promised himself that if the opportunity to fight for his honor arose again, he would not be silenced. Not this time. The Chief of Internal Affairs, in her office, reviewed the names Santos had sent. Sergeant Almeida was there, yes, but also other officers who had been rapidly promoted. The web was complex, but she could see the knots. The anonymous threat had been a mistake. It had confirmed that she was close to something big, something the beneficiaries of the shadow did not want to come to light. She knew that the search for Mendez's file in the external warehouse would be risky. Those who benefited from his silence would not allow the truth to come out easily. The game was just beginning, and the stakes were the reputation of an entire force and the life of a man who had been wronged. And she, the Chief of Internal Affairs, was determined to turn the tables. The name Ricardo Mendez was no longer just a case. It was the tip of the iceberg of a truth that needed to be revealed. The Chief of Internal Affairs knew that time was an enemy. The bureaucracy to access the external warehouse was an artificial but effective barrier. Each authorization request, each stamp, each signature seemed to drag on, as if the gears of the machine were purposefully rusted. Santos reported that the process was under review by a department that rarely handled such requisitions, a clear, delaying tactic. The chief, with a gaze of steel, instructed Santos to bypass it. "Use a search warrant, Director. If they don't want to cooperate, we'll force the door. There's no time for subtlety." The urgency in her voice was a reflection of the growing pressure she felt. Another anonymous phone call had come in, this time with a female voice, calmer but equally threatening. "Some secrets are better buried, Chief. Don't become another victim." The message was clear. They knew she was getting close. Meanwhile, Ricardo Mendez was on the move. He had spent the night studying surveillance patterns, escape routes, and blind spots in the city. The informant, a woman named Lucia, lived in a modest neighborhood, but the area was known for its alleys and back streets, perfect for getting lost or being cornered. Ricardo used his counterintelligence knowledge to throw off his pursuers. A switched taxi, a detour through a busy market, an entrance through an abandoned building. Every step was calculated, every shadow an ally. He felt the adrenaline, the same that propelled him in high-risk operations. It wasn't fear, but a sharpened focus. Arriving at Lucia's building, Ricardo felt a chill. Her apartment door was ajar, a warning sign. He drew his 9mm, moving with the fluidity of a predator. The silence inside was heavy, unnatural. He entered, sweeping the environment. The apartment was ransacked, furniture overturned, papers scattered. Lucia was not there, but on the floor, under a broken vase, he found a small metal box. Inside, a USB drive and a scribbled note. "They came. The file is here. Look for Project Shadow." Ricardo felt a mix of frustration and hope. Lucia was in danger, or worse. But she had left a clue. Project Shadow was a name he vaguely remembered from his days in the Force, an internal security project that had been abruptly cancelled. Back in his improvised hideout, Ricardo inserted the USB drive into a secure laptop. The files were encrypted, but Mendez's experience in information security was vast. Hours passed, the tension growing with each line of deciphered code. Finally, the screen flickered, revealing folders and documents. They were detailed reports of an internal investigation into an extortion and money laundering network involving high-ranking officials within the force. Sergeant Almeida's name appeared repeatedly, not as a mere officer, but as a crucial link in the network's chain of command. And more shockingly, there was a list of names of officers who benefited, including that of the officer who had handcuffed him on that fateful day. The mistake that led to his downfall was not a mistake, but a cold, calculated execution. At the same instant, Director Santos, with a search warrant in hand, led his team to the external warehouse. The bureaucratic resistance had turned into physical opposition. Two men in suits with private security badges tried to block the entrance, claiming lack of jurisdiction. Santos, with the Chief of Internal Affairs on speakerphone, did not back down. "Clear the way or you will be arrested for obstruction of justice," he growled, his voice laden with authority. The chief, on the other end of the line, heard the tension. "Director, do not hesitate. The truth is in there." The guards hesitated, exchanging glances. The warehouse door, a rusty iron gate, creaked as Santos pushed it open. The smell of mold and old paper filled the air. Thousands of boxes, piles of documents, a labyrinth of forgotten secrets. The hunt had reached its turning point. They were inside. But what would they find? And who was watching from afar, waiting for the right moment to act? The chief knew that the invasion of the warehouse was just the beginning of a war. The iron gate creaked, opening into an abyss of dust and silence. The smell of mold and old paper was an invitation to the past, to a forgotten time, where secrets were carefully stacked to rot. Director Santos, with the Chief of Internal Affairs still on speakerphone, felt the weight of that place. Thousands of boxes, piles of documents, a labyrinth of buried truths. Santos's team, armed with flashlights and masks, entered the warehouse, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. The chief, on the other end of the line, could almost feel the humidity and tension. "Director!" Focus on anything related to Lieutenant Mendez, the parallel investigation, and look for mentions of sensitive files or Project Shadow. Leave no stone unturned. The search began. It was a Herculean task, boxes upon boxes, some intact, others disintegrated by time. Each label was a potential clue, each document a fragment of a puzzle. Santos's team worked with silent determination, knowing they were in hostile territory. It wasn't long before one of the agents, a young analyst with an unusual knack for details, found something. In a section that seemed to have been recently disturbed, a box was out of place. On it, a scratched label. Mendez, Case 734. Destroy. But the box was not empty. Inside, among generic disposal reports, was a thin folder. With no external identification, the analyst opened it with gloves, revealing a series of internal memos. "Director, I found something. It appears to be an access log for these files. Several dates, but one name repeats. Sergeant Almeida." Santos took the folder, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Almeida, the name the chief had mentioned. The link. He transmitted the information to the chief. "Almeida was here, Chief, and not long ago." Her voice came firmer now. "That confirms it. He was trying to cover his tracks. Continue, Director. What else do those records say?" The folder revealed not only Almeida's accesses, but also a list of documents he had consulted. Among them, a reference to internal security reports, Project Shadow. The chief felt a shiver. That name, it was the second time she had heard it. Meanwhile, in his improvised hideout, Ricardo Mendez delved into the depths of Lucia's USB drive. Project Shadow was not just a name, it was a secret operation, initiated years earlier, to investigate the infiltration of an extortion and money laundering network within the force itself. The files were a treasure trove of information, recorded conversations, bank statements, surveillance reports, and the names. Oh, the names. The list was extensive, and many of them had been his colleagues, some even his superiors. Sergeant Almeida appeared as one of the main orchestrators, a key facilitator in money laundering and protecting those involved. But what shocked Ricardo most was seeing the name of the officer who had handcuffed him on that fateful day, the same one who, with an arrogant smile, had sealed his fate. It was not a mistake. It was a planned coup, a cold execution to silence the investigation that he, Ricardo, was leading. Anger simmered, but was quickly replaced by a chilling determination. He had the proof. Vindication was within his grasp. Ricardo knew he couldn't simply hand over the USB drive. The network was powerful, and the information could be suppressed, or he himself eliminated. He needed a plan that would ensure the truth came out and that he would be safe. He began to copy the files, spreading them across several encrypted servers, creating a digital trail that would be impossible to erase. He also prepared a package of key information, a concise summary with the most incriminating evidence and the name Project Shadow highlighted. He needed an intermediary, someone outside the force, but with credibility. An investigative journalist he knew from years ago, someone he trusted. Back at the warehouse, Santos's team had found more. In a sealed box marked obsolete material was a series of Project Shadow reports. These were the originals, the ones that should have been incinerated. The documents detailed the structure of the criminal network, the extortion operations, the illicit payments. And most importantly, there was a final report signed by a Lieutenant Ricardo Mendez, which pointed directly to Sergeant Almeida and other high-ranking officers. The Chief of Internal Affairs heard Santos read the excerpts, his voice choked with discovery. "Chief, it's all here. The proof that Mendez was silenced. The mistake was a sham, and Almeida is much more than a corrupt sergeant. He's a vital cog." The chief hung up the phone, the weight of the truth overwhelming. The puzzle was coming together, but the feeling of victory was briefly replaced by a premonition. If Almeida had been in the warehouse, if he was trying to erase the tracks, it meant they were on the move. They knew they were being hunted, and the anonymous phone call, the female voice, the threat of becoming a victim, echoed in her mind. She knew that truth was a powerful weapon, but also a target. That same night, Ricardo sent the encrypted information package to the journalist, with clear instructions to publish it only if he did not make contact within 48 hours. It was his insurance policy. Then, he sent an anonymous and encrypted message to the official email of the Chief of Internal Affairs. A single sentence: Project Shadow, the file is alive. Look for Mendez. He knew it was a risk, but it was a calculated risk. The chief, upon receiving the message, felt a chill down her spine. The name, the confirmation. Ricardo Mendez was not just alive, he was fighting, and he had the evidence. The game had turned. The hunt was now mutual, and the predators, who once felt safe in the shadows, were about to become the prey. The war was declared, and the first battle was about to erupt. The chill down the Chief of Internal Affairs' spine was not just a premonition, it was confirmation that the game had turned. The anonymous encrypted message with just one sentence, Project Shadow, the file is alive, look for Mendez, resonated in her mind like thunder. Ricardo Mendez was not just a silenced victim, he was an active player. a spectre refusing to be erased. Urgency seized her. That name, Project Shadow, echoed what Santos had found in the warehouse. The synchronicity was chilling, the proof irrefutable. She dialed Santos's number, her voice firm, but with a tone of contained adrenaline. "Director, the message has arrived. Mendes is alive, and he has the file. This means time is running out for them and for us." On the other end of the line, Santos felt the weight of those words. The truth, once a dusty whisper, now screamed from the yellowed pages his team unearthed. The Project Shadow reports were a detailed map of corruption, a labyrinth of names, dates, and illicit transactions. And at the center of it all, Sergeant Almeida and the officer who had handcuffed Ricardo. The chief gave precise orders. "Director, consolidate all evidence, prepare arrest warrants. I want Almeida and everyone involved in custody before dawn, and above all, find Mendes. He is the key, but also a target." Santos's team worked feverishly, digitizing documents, cross-referencing information. Every line of code from Lucia's USB drive, every report from the warehouse, painted a grim picture of betrayal and power. The force was rotten from within, and the operation to clean it would be brutal. Meanwhile, news of the warehouse raid soon reached Almeida's ears. The corruption network, though shaken, still had its tentacles. An anonymous phone call, a distorted voice, confirmed his worst fears. "They're inside, Sergeant. They found the Project Shadow files, and Mendes's name is all over it." For Almeida and his accomplices, their world was collapsing. Invulnerability, a carefully constructed illusion, crumbled in seconds. Panic set in, but quickly turned into a cold fury. They knew Mendes was alive. They knew he had the evidence, and they knew they had to act before the truth came out. The officer who had handcuffed Ricardo, the same one who sported an arrogant smile, was in his office, fists clenched. The news of the warehouse, the mention of Mendes, was a direct blow to his career, to his life. He could not allow it. Not after everything. The order was clear, transmitted by Almeida in an icy tone. "Find Mendes and the woman. Leave no trace." The hunt had intensified, and now the predators were becoming desperate hunters. In his improvised hideout, Ricardo felt the change in the air. The message to the chief had been sent. The package to the journalist, his insurance policy, was on its way. He had lit a fuse, and the explosion was imminent, but the feeling of victory was tempered by concern for Lucia. Her apartment ransacked, the scribbled note. He knew she was in danger, perhaps already in their hands. Ricardo could not wait. He needed more than vindication. He needed justice for Lucia. He reviewed the USB drive files once more, looking for any clue about her whereabouts, any name that could lead him to her. A surveillance report, dated weeks earlier, caught his attention. Details about a safe meeting point, used by the network for interrogations and delicate conversations. An abandoned warehouse in the port area, a place he knew well from old operations. It was a shot in the dark, but it was the only lead he had. He knew he was putting himself at risk, walking straight into the lion's den. But the image of Lucia, her worried face, her courage in leaving the clue, spurred him on. He was no longer the handcuffed lieutenant, humiliated. He was a man with nothing to lose and everything to gain. Anger and determination mixed into an explosive cocktail. While Director Santos and the Chief of Internal Affairs mobilized their teams for the arrests, Ricardo was already on the move. He left the hideout, the 9mm again in hand, his gaze fixed on the night horizon. The city, under the moonlight, seemed a stage for the approaching battle. Every second was a ticking clock, bringing the inevitable closer. The war was declared, and the first battle was about to erupt. But Ricardo was not waiting for it. He was going to meet it. Truth was his weapon, and justice his only goal. He had become the hunter and the predators who once felt safe in the shadows, were about to become the prey. The night swallowed the city, but for Ricardo Mendes, it was an ally, a protective cloak as he moved through the back streets, a ghost seeking justice. Every step was calculated, every shadow, a potential hiding place. The 9mm, cold and heavy in his hand, was a constant reminder of the point of no return he had chosen. There was no more time for hesitation, for the fear that had once paralyzed him. The image of Lucia, her frightened face, the scribbled note, was etched in his mind, transforming concern into a contained fury, an implacable engine. The warehouse in the port area was a relic of a forgotten industrial past, a labyrinth of concrete and rust that exuded the smell of mold and salinity. From afar, the city lights seemed distant, like stars indifferent to a human drama about to unfold. Ricardo approached with the caution of a predator, his senses sharpened by adrenaline. Every sound, every movement of the wind was analyzed. He mentally reviewed the security schemes the corrupt network typically used, the escape routes, the blind spots. His years of experience in service, in patrols and secret operations, resurfaced, sharp and lethal. Meanwhile, the chief of internal affairs in her office was a command center. Ricardo's message, the name Project Shadow, had catalyzed a large-scale operation. Director Santos's teams, armed with arrest warrants, dispersed throughout the city like an inevitable plague. The main target, Sergeant Almeida and the officer who had handcuffed Ricardo, whose names now shone red in the newly discovered reports. The chief felt the weight of responsibility, but also a chilling satisfaction. The truth, however painful, was finally coming to light. The first blow came fast and precise. A team raided the residence of one of the high-ranking officers mentioned in Lucia's files. Resistance was minimal, the surprise total, but the chief knew the network was vast and that the bigger fish would be harder to catch. She kept the phone to her ear, receiving constant updates, her voice firm but with palpable tension. No chance of escape, no evidence destroyed. I want all of them. On the other side of the city, Sergeant Almeida and the arrogant officer were in a frenzy of despair. News of the warehouse raid had spread like wildfire, and now the first reports of arrests of their accomplices were arriving. Their world, built on lies and extortion, was crumbling. The officer, whose name was Captain Vasconcelos, punched the table, his face contorted with rage and fear. Mendes, that bastard. He couldn't be alive. Almeida, calmer, but with a dangerous glint in his eyes, dialed numbers feverishly. It doesn't matter. He's alive, and he has the evidence. And the woman. The woman is with him, or knows where he is. We need to find them before the chief gets to us. The warehouse. It's the only safe place now, and maybe the only place to silence Mendes once and for all. His voice was a hoarse whisper, but the threat was unmistakable. They knew the chief was coming, and that the only chance of survival was to eliminate the source of the truth. In the abandoned warehouse, Ricardo crept through the shadows, the smell of rusted metal and dust filling his nostrils. The darkness was almost total, broken only by slivers of moonlight filtering through broken windows. The silence was oppressive, but Ricardo knew it was a trap. He listened, a whisper, a movement. It wasn't empty. His eyes adjusted to the gloom, and he saw, in the center of the warehouse, tied to a chair, was Lucia. Her mouth was gagged, her eyes wide with fear, but also with silent determination. She was injured but alive. The sight of Lucia ignited an even more intense flame in Ricardo. Personal revenge against Vasconcelos and Almeida, the vindication of his name, all now mingled with the visceral need to protect her. He was no longer just fighting for himself, he was fighting for her, for all who had been silenced. He knew they were there, waiting. The trap was set, but Ricardo was not the prey they expected. He was the hunter, and the warehouse, the stage for his revenge. A metallic clang echoed from an adjacent room. It was confirmation. They were there, Vasconcelos and Almeida, perhaps with other thugs. Ricardo took a deep breath, the air heavy with dust and anticipation. He moved, not to rescue Lucia immediately, but to gain an advantage, to neutralize the threat. He was a man with nothing to lose, and that was his greatest strength. The war was not just declared, it had reached its final battlefield, and Ricardo Mendez, the handcuffed lieutenant, was about to rewrite his own destiny, and that of an entire corrupt force. The first battle was about to erupt, and the sound of gunshots would be just the prelude to a truth that could no longer be silenced. The darkness of the warehouse was a cloak, and Ricardo, a ghost beneath it. Every step was a whisper, every shadow a potential ally. He was no longer the man who hesitated. He was the personification of contained fury, of tactical experience forged in years of service. The smell of rusted metal and dust was the perfume of revenge. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom, swept the environment, mapping every obstacle, every blind spot. The 9mm in his hand was an extension of his will. He moved towards the metallic clang he had heard, a sound that confirmed the presence of his tormentors. A half-open door revealed an adjacent room, dimly lit by a hanging lamp. Inside, 2 men, Almeida's thugs, conversed in low voices, their silhouettes projected on the wall. Ricardo did not hesitate. With a surgeon's precision, he infiltrated. A quick movement, a dry blow to the back of one's neck, the other silenced before he could even react. The bodies fell without a sound, absorbed by the dust and oblivion of the warehouse. Ricardo took a radio from one of them, an open channel to Almeida's network. Back in the main hall, Lucia was there, tied to the chair, her eyes wide, but firm. The sight of her, wounded but resilient, ignited an even more intense flame in Ricardo. He approached, a blur in the darkness, and she saw him. A flash of hope, mixed with fear, crossed her face. He gestured for her to remain silent, his eyes conveying a promise. Suddenly, louder voices echoed from an improvised office at the back of the warehouse, Almeida and Vasconcelos. Ricardo hid behind a pile of boxes, the radio in his hand, tuned to their channel. Vasconcelos's voice, laden with panic and rage, filled the space. "The chief is coming, Sergeant. Our escape routes are cut off. The first ones have already fallen. Mendez, that bastard must have given us away." Almeida's icy voice replied, a distilled venom. "Calm down, Captain. No panic. We have Mendez and the woman here. They are the proof. Without them, there's no case. We need to silence them. Now." Ricardo felt a shiver. Silence them. The word echoed, cold and lethal. He looked at Lucia, who watched him with silent intensity. He knew he couldn't wait. The trap was set, but he was not the prey. He was the hunter. Through the radio, he heard footsteps approaching. Almeida and Vasconcelos, with 2 more thugs, emerged from the office, guns drawn. The dim lamp in the warehouse cast distorted shadows, transforming them into grotesque figures. "Where is he?" Vasconcelos growled, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Mendez, show yourself, you coward! There's nowhere to run!" Ricardo emerged from the shadows, the 9mm aimed, his voice a thunder in the quiet of the warehouse. "I don't run, Captain. I hunt." Surprise froze the men for an instant. Vasconcelos, his face contorted with hatred, pointed his weapon. "Mendez, how? How did you escape?" "You underestimated the truth, Captain, and me." Ricardo held the gun steady, his eyes fixed on Vasconcelos. "Where's the rest of your team, the others who handcuffed an innocent man?" Almeida, more calculating, tried a diversion tactic. "It doesn't matter, Mendez. Your journey ends here. You and the girl." He signaled to one of the thugs to go towards Lucia. Ricardo did not hesitate. A shot echoed, precise and quick, hitting the thug in the shoulder. The man fell, screaming in pain. The diversion failed. "No one touches her!" Ricardo roared, rage exploding. Vasconcelos, with his usual arrogance, ignored the injured man. "It doesn't matter! It's 4 against 1! Handcuff him! Handcuff that traitor and the tramp. I want both of them dead and thrown in the harbor before the chief gets here." Vasconcelos's order, uttered with such certainty, resonated in the warehouse. But before his thugs could react, a new sound filled the air. Sirens. Not distant, but close. And then the voice of the Chief of Internal Affairs, amplified by a megaphone, cut through the night. "Police! Hands up! The warehouse is surrounded! I repeat, the warehouse is surrounded! Sergeant Almeida, Captain Vasconcelos, surrender immediately!" The main door of the warehouse burst open with a crash, revealing a SWAT team from Internal Affairs, led by Director Santos, all with weapons aimed. The light from the floodlights flooded the space, momentarily blinding the corrupt officers. Panic seized Vasconcelos and Almeida. Their faces, previously full of fury, now displayed palpable terror. "It can't be," Vasconcelos stammered, his voice failing. How did they find us?" The Chief of Internal Affairs entered, her figure imposing, her gaze fixed on Vasconcelos. "The mistake, Captain, was underestimating the truth and the intelligence of ex-Lieutenant Mendez." She pointed to Ricardo, "especially when he sends irrefutable evidence to a journalist and to me, and when he, as a precaution, records every word of your confession and your order to silence him." She gestured to one of her agents, who held a small recorder. The audio of Vasconcelos's voice, clear and unmistakable, echoed through the warehouse. "Handcuff him. Handcuff that traitor and the tramp. I want both of them dead and thrown in the harbor before the chief gets here." The silence that followed was deafening. Vasconcelos paled, his arrogance crumbling in seconds. Almeida tried to draw his weapon, but was immediately immobilized by Santos's agents. The Chief of Internal Affairs approached Vasconcelos, her eyes cold as ice. "Captain Vasconcelos, you are under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, obstruction of justice and corruption, and for having arrogantly and illegally handcuffed and humiliated an innocent officer." She turned to one of her agents. "Handcuff him, and make sure every movement is recorded. I want him to feel the weight of the justice he so disdained." The agent approached Vasconcelos, who trembled, his eyes wide with disbelief and despair. The handcuffs, the same ones he had used to arrest Ricardo, now closed on his own wrists. The metallic sound echoed, an epitaph for his career and his freedom. The scene was a distorted mirror of the past, but with a different ending. The arrogant officer who had given the order to handcuff was now the handcuffed. Ricardo, still holding his weapon, watched the scene, a wave of relief and satisfaction washing over him. Vindication was sweet, but the priority was Lucia. He ran to her, cutting her bonds. She hugged him, tears streaming, but her eyes shone with renewed strength. "You did it, Ricardo," she whispered, her voice choked. He held her tight. "We did it, Lucia. The truth always finds a way." The warehouse, once a stage of terror, was now the scene of a bitter but just victory. The war was far from over. The force still needed to be cleaned, but the first and most important battle had been won. Ricardo Mendez, the handcuffed ex-lieutenant, had rewritten his destiny, and justice, finally, was beginning to be served. The night swallowed the city, but the light of truth had pierced the darkness. The night swallowed the city, but the light of truth had pierced the darkness. In the warehouse, the chaos of internal affairs intervention began to give way to a cold and relentless order. Uniformed agents moved with precision, collecting evidence, isolating the area. Vasconcelos, now handcuffed, was a pathetic figure, his once arrogant face now a map of despair and humiliation. Almeida, equally restrained, maintained an icy gaze, but the tremor in his hands betrayed the collapse of his empire of lies. The chief of internal affairs, a force of nature amidst the storm, supervised everything with calculated calm. Her eyes, which had once shone with the fury of justice, now observed the scene with the contained satisfaction of someone who saw a promise fulfilled. For Ricardo, the sound of the handcuffs closing on Vasconcelos's wrists was more than a metallic echo. It was the symphony of redemption. Each beat, each click, undid a little of the injustice that had suffocated him. He held Lucia, feeling the warmth of her trembling body, her irregular breathing. Her tears, once of fear, were now of relief, wetting his shoulder. "It's all right now," he whispered, more to himself than to her, trying to convince his own heart that the nightmare had indeed come to an end. But the truth was that the end of one nightmare was just the beginning of a new reality, and that reality would demand more than just the arrest of a few corrupt individuals. The chief of internal affairs approached Ricardo, her eyes assessing him with a mixture of respect and admiration. "Lieutenant Mendez," she said, her voice firm, "your courage and integrity were key to dismantling this network. The country owes you a great deal." She looked at Vasconcelos and Almeida, who were being led away, escorted by agents. "As for them, the process will be swift and exemplary. The evidence is overwhelming. The recording of their orders, the attempted murder, the obstruction of justice, the systemic corruption. They will not only be expelled from the force, but will face the full extent of the law. Their careers are over, their reputations in ruins. Justice, Lieutenant, is not just an ideal. It is an implacable force when awakened." Ricardo merely nodded, his mind still processing the magnitude of what had happened. He did not feel like a hero, just a man who had refused to be silenced. Lucia, now calmer, squeezed his hand. Her presence was a reminder that his fight had not been just for himself, but for all those who had been victims of the system. The chief of internal affairs continued. "Your name will be cleared, Lieutenant. Your reinstatement will be immediate, with all due honors and promotions. The force needs men like you, now more than ever, to rebuild the trust that has been so brutally shattered." The offer was tempting, the vindication complete. But Ricardo looked at the shadows of the warehouse, at the vestiges of corruption that still hung in the air. He had seen the darkest side of the force, the rot that hid beneath the veneer of the law. To return meant to plunge back into that swamp, even if now with more power and support. He felt the weight of the decision, the fatigue of a battle that had pushed him to his limit. "I need some time, Chief," he replied, his voice hoarse, "to process all this, to decide what I really want to do." She understood, a nod of her head. "I understand, but know that the doors will always be open. The fight against corruption is continuous, and we need warriors like you." In the days that followed, Ricardo Mendez's story exploded in the media. The journalist, who had received Ricardo's evidence, published a series of investigative reports that shocked the country. The recording of Vasconcelos's order, played exhaustively, became the symbol of the arrogance and impunity that corroded the police. Vasconcelos and Almeida were formally charged, and their expulsions from the force were announced with great fanfare, a symbolic gesture that the cleansing had begun. Other names, once untouchable, began to fall. Internal Affairs, strengthened by the victory, launched a massive campaign of restructuring and internal auditing, promising transparency and accountability. Trust in the police, shaken by so many scandals, began to be slowly restored, but the scar remained. Ricardo and Lucia, together, watched the news, the feeling of duty accomplished mixed with the bitterness of losses. Lucia, recovered from her injuries, decided to use her experience to fight for other victims of injustice, finding new strength in her own resilience. She had been a fundamental piece, the witness who refused to be silenced, and now, Her voice echoed louder than ever, inspiring others not to be silent. Ricardo, after weeks of reflection, made his decision. He would not return to the force immediately. He needed a new beginning, a time to heal the invisible wounds that the battle had left, but he would not abandon the fight. He would dedicate himself to helping Lucia in her new mission, using his knowledge and experience to combat corruption in another way, perhaps as a consultant, perhaps as an activist. The truth was that once one saw the darkness, it was impossible to ignore it. He had been handcuffed, humiliated, almost killed, but he had emerged stronger, more determined. The command, "Handcuff him," had been uttered with contempt, intended to silence a man. But ironically, that arrogant order, recorded and exposed, became the catalyst for a revolution. The arrogant officer was in fact handcuffed and expelled, but the ex-lieutenant, who should have been the final target, became the herald of a new era. The night, which once swallowed the city with its darkness, was now pierced by countless points of light, each representing a truth that could no longer be silenced. The war against corruption was long, but the first and most important battle had been won. And Ricardo Mendez, the man who refused to fall, was ready for what came next, with Lucia by his side, and the certainty that justice, however slow, would always find its way to the light.